Hello, my name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm a Microsoft MVP in Office Development. This module is Fundamentals of Microsoft Teams. This module has three sections: Teams Application, Packaging, and Testing, Build a Basic Microsoft Teams Bot, and Build a Microsoft Teams tab. In the first section, Teams Application, Packaging, and Testing, we will cover what a Teams application means, what is the extensibility options that they contain, and we'll follow up with a demo on how to create one. Extending Microsoft Teams has two high-level approaches. One is to create a Microsoft Teams app. Included in a Microsoft Teams app are tabs and bots and connectors, as well as compose extensions. The other option is to create a custom bot, which will only receive and reply to messages. Custom bots are a quick way to get started if you have a bot that interacts with other applications such as Skype and you want to extend it into Microsoft Teams. Your best, most full-featured method would be creating a Microsoft Teams app, but again, you can do one-offs with the custom bot. So what is a Microsoft Teams app? Well, look at the app as a package of services that you can use to extend the interface. And these services, as we mentioned, are tabs, bots, compose extensions, and connectors. All of these services are then provided inside a certain scope or a context. They can be personal scopes, such as a one-on-one between your application and one user, or added to a channel inside a team to let all members of the team interact with your application. And lastly, that we have to consider that these are packaged and deployed in some manner. One approach is to do a side load, which is what we will do here in this module, or they can be published and registered with Microsoft's Office Store and then made available through the typical deployment mechanisms that you'd expect. Why would I create an app? Right? So as we said, it has many different services, but the key things we're going to talk about here we'll lay out on this slide. We have an immersive experience. If you've used Microsoft Teams, you'll see that it allows me to have conversations with people. I can have a tab that shows up in a user interface. It lets me have a single place to go to do my work. If I'm working with one or more teams, I don't have to flip back between applications. As we mentioned, you can have tabs and conversations, and a tab is an iframe into your application. So think of this as you have an application and you want to surface this data. You can do so on a tab. And by extending the tab with some functionality, you can then initiate a conversation so people can then jump between doing work in your application or consuming data from your application, as well as conversations with others that have similar interests or have a similar goal, and let us resolve those issues if they come up. When I use an app, instead of just posting a message to a channel, I can do customizable cards. Cards give me a rich way to show information, as well as provide actionable links that can then reduce the friction for users to get things done. We can bring the full power of the bot framework to bear. The bot framework has natural language processing. It lets me, again, interact with many different services any way I see. The users can have a better experience using the bot framework. Microsoft Teams allows for toast notifications and an activity feed, so you can leverage those capabilities for super important items that you want people to act on. You can use that push information to them. And lastly, a compose extension, which can help guide your users to choose the right option or to do pre-canned responses. Again, we're trying to reduce the friction. We're trying to enable people to get their job done interacting with your application. All of these things can be bundled into a Teams application. You do not need to choose every single one of them, but these are all the things that are available. And most developers, I would expect, would start small, maybe integrate a tab, and then after people get familiar with that, we can extend that to include some other type of bot or deep linking to help users grow their use of the application once they're familiar with it. So we've shown you what a simple app is now. Let's go switch over and do a quick demo to create a Teams app and deploy it. So for this demo, we're going to start in a command prompt. We're going to scaffold a sample application using the Yeoman generator for Microsoft Teams. In the hands-on lab, you have steps on how to install all these prerequisite tools, but we're just going to focus on the bootstrapping and scaffolding at the moment now. So first I'm going to create a directory that will then hold my application. And then I'm going to switch into that directory. And next I'm going to run the Yeoman generator, and I'm going to use the Microsoft Teams generator. The Yeoman generator will ask a bunch of questions, and based on the answers, it will then scaffold the project for me. So I'm going to accept the default for almost all of these. For the URL that I will host this tab, I see I'm putting in a value that says TBD. I don't know that value yet. I'm going to use the ngrok tunnel to do that, and I get the URL when I invoke the tunnel. So for now, we'll just leave it as a placeholder. I'm just going to do a tab for the moment using the default name, and now Yeoman has created the scaffolding for my project using the source folder you see here, and in the background it is downloading a bunch of supporting node modules to help do the building of the code, and as well as the packaging and web serving. So while that's running, I'm going to switch to a different command window, and I'm going to run the ngrok command. I'm specifying I want a proxy on the HTTP protocol, and it routes to localhost 3007. So now I have a publicly accessible address that I can then use to interact with my web server from the internet. So I've copied that to the clipboard. You'll notice that Yeoman has finished up. It's doing some last minute housekeeping here at the end here, and in a moment it'll come back to the command prompt. And at that point I want to then update my app manifest. So I'm just going to use Visual Studio Code to do that. I'm going to invoke code. We'll take a look at the scaffolded application. So you can see here's all my folders. I have node modules, again, which is a bunch of supporting stuff I don't need to go poke around in there. I have a collection of files that I use to configure the environment, the transpile from TypeScript to JavaScript, and Webpack, and so on. I'm going to open up the source folder, and you can see here I have two folders in here. One is the app, contains the actual code for my app, as well as the manifest. Right now I'm going to open up the manifest, and this is a file that describes my application to Microsoft Teams. I'm going to do a search and replace real quick here, and my placeholder value, and put in the actual value that I have. So we'll put this in here. And key thing to point out here, this is static values here for a privacy URL. You can see I have in my app, you will see I have the terms of a sample terms of use and privacy. Further down you'll see I have a tab, and a tab is configured with a configuration URL. Right? So that's value in here. So that's what we see inside my web folders, all these HTML. And inside of scripts I have a collection of TypeScript files. So first thing I want to do is get this working. I just want to get this into Microsoft Teams. So I'm going to switch back to my command prompt again, and I'm going in that same directory. I'm going to use the gulp task runner to create the manifest. This task will then look at that manifest file and create what I need to provide to Microsoft Teams. All right, so now I have my manifest built. I'm going to then run the build task. The build task will then transpile the TypeScript, do the Webpack, to see how that works. And then lastly, after that's done, I'm going to then start the web server. This will make my web pages and the JavaScript listening on localhost port 3007, which just happens to be where ngrok will be routing information. So I've now prepped my PC, I scaffolded an application, I've built it, I've compiled it, I created a manifest, and I'm ready to upload the application. I'm going to switch over to Microsoft Teams, and you see I've built a brand new team just for Demo 1, and I'm going to go and manage that team. When you configure Microsoft Teams to have the developer preview that's enabled here, and again, the Hands-On Lab will help you get that, inside your apps selection here, I can now sideload an app. And sideload an app, what sideload an app really means is I'm going to update my, I'm going to provide my manifest. The package folder is what gulp space manifest built. It built this zip file that has the relevant information. I'm going to click that, and you can see Microsoft Team will then read that zip file, unpack it, and it says, oh, okay, you have Teams app 1, right? And it's been sideloaded. So now my app has been added to Microsoft Teams. My app contains a tab. So if I go back to any channel inside that team, I can now add a new tab. So I'm going to click add, and you'll see here in the list of tabs to add is my tab. It pops up with my configuration page. I can then enter a setting. And I'm going to do that and click save. And so my tab now, this simple scaffolded tab just says whatever you typed in, I'm going to remember and show it to you on the tab. If I go back to the conversation, you'll see that a conversation has begun on tabs 1. If I click on that, it takes me right to my tab. So that is a simple way for me to go through and say I want to create an application, in this case with just a tab, bundle that, package it up, deploy it to Microsoft Teams. So while we're here, I'm going to switch back over to ngrok, and you'll see all the requests for the various pages that were used by Microsoft Teams have then been routed from the internet to my local host. One tip I will show that this is very helpful. If I look here, the part of what ngrok provides is a little local proxy. So I can go to localhost 4040, and if I do that, it'll show those same steps that were here. And the key difference here, of course, is that I can look at the request and response, and we'll do this a lot more when we're working with bots. Again, this is just a sample. Let's get started. We'll use Node, use the Yeoman generator, and scaffold up my application. So let's review how we make our Teams app. We start by developing components. We use HTML, TypeScript, JavaScript, .NET, Node, whatever utilities you need to create the individual components of our app. Right? Then we build the Teams application to integrate with Teams. We decide how are we going to integrate using JavaScript. We're going to do a bot. What are the places we need here? How do we get the components to integrate with Microsoft Teams? And then package and deploy them. Again, you host the web pages or services in some fashion. You create a manifest and you provide that manifest to Microsoft Teams, and that will then make it available. Now let's move on to section 2, build a basic Microsoft Teams bot. We will cover the overview of what the bot, how to build a bot, discussing on the bot framework versus a custom bot, and then look through the various conversations and capabilities that are leveraged using a bot. The first step is to design a great bot. And there's a couple of things that you want to make sure you understand here, right? So you want to be responsive. You don't want a bot to do a lot of work. You want it to be responsive. You want it to understand many different flavors of questions. So make sure that you can respond quickly and at least provide users on the right path. Or if you can't answer the question, provide a way to find more information. Recognizing and responding to questions and non-questions is key as well. Again, people interacting with bots are going to expect some natural language processing. You definitely will want to integrate that. This module covers integrating Microsoft Teams bots, so we don't go in-depth on natural language processing, but the bot framework does allow that. Another key thing to consider is give your bot a personality. We'll talk about that more in the middle, but don't just have a robot. Let's make it something better. After we've designed what we're trying to accomplish, we need to build it, right? We can use the Bot Builder SDK for .NET or for Node.js. Both of those are available. And again, to repeat the common theme, once we have that, we then need to deploy it. Now, deploying a bot is not just adding it to Microsoft Teams, but we need to register it with the bot framework to get its credentials, and then you can move forward. One item to strongly encourage is to enable analytics, so you can see how users are interacting with your bot, what questions they're asking, what questions are they asking that you cannot answer, and give you ability to extend your bot over time, give it some more intelligence. We mentioned the bot personality, and there's a couple different approaches to do this, right? You can have no personality, which is what most developers might start with, but think further about how we can put some personality and get some natural responses to things, and make sure you have a personality, and you want to be consistent in this personality, these all parts of your bot, so that you can give your users a good, comfortable experience. As you're conversing with users, a couple basic items that I understand now. Everything is done using an activity object, and this activity object is going to be passing data between your users and the bot. Right? An activity has a messages property, and it provides a couple different key data points that we'd want here. Obviously, the text is in there. The text could be plain text, it could be markdown. I can have attachments, right, which would be the cards that we saw in the introduction. It can be simple media objects as well. And lastly, the message also has a collection of entities so that I know with whom I'm interacting. Obviously, one entity is the bot client, but users as part of the conversation are also exposed to the entity's property. The bot framework helps manage the conversation flow using what's called dialogues. Right? And dialogues have a pre and a post event, so I can understand what the information is going to happen. I wait to respond to or influence the conversation. There is a dialogue stack that's maintained by the bot framework, and a dialogue stack is helpful if you want to have a a back and forth conversation with the user. What is your name? My name is Paul. Do you prefer spaces or tabs? And you can say, well, welcome, Paul. I see that you understand. You have a preference for this. Lastly, there is a state service. So if you ask a user for their name, you can say, oh, store this in a state service. So I know with this particular user, his name is Paul. Right? And the state is available per user, per conversation, or what they call private, which is a user in a conversation. Conversations have two flavors. We can have a channel conversation, which is included inside a channel in a team, and you can access team data or channel data. You can understand all the members that are in that channel as well. Right? There's also a one-on-one conversation, which is just your bot and the user. There's no access to the team here. I don't have to worry about @ references to target information to different people. It's just one-on-one. Right? And in both of these conversations support events so that your bot can be aware when a conversation is initiated or when the bot is first initiated by one-on-one or when a user or the bot are added and removed from a channel so you can keep track of what's happening in these conversations. As we mentioned, we have messages, and messages contain very different multiple properties. And so this slide is just a quick summary to show you that from the user to the bot, I can get text and pictures, right? Which means the user can upload an image. They can type rich text into the bot window. But you'll notice I can't send a card or an emoji back in. If you want something a little bit more than just text or pictures, the Compose extension can help you pass data that's a little bit more full-featured as opposed to just pictures and text. Conversely, from the bot to the user, we can send text and pictures and cards and emojis, right? And the details are specified there on the table. The bot framework supports many types of cards. However, Teams has a subset that they support, and they're listed here. We have the hero card, which gets us a big full screen, well, not full screen exactly, but a large picture, a lot of description. We can have a thumbnail, which is just a snippet of information, a small picture, and it supports the Office 365 connector card format. And the Office 365 connector card, while the picture is somewhat sparse, the Office 365 connector card can have images as well as sections and lots of text and so on. And that's the most flexible, provides lots of options. One of the other key benefits is it's supported if you're using Office 365 group conversations using Exchange. And so if you are writing a code to generate a card, you could interact with the group conversations through Exchange as well as conversations through Teams by using the Office 365 connector card. You'll notice that each of these cards have buttons at the bottom, right? And these or links, and those links are called actions, right? So activity objects that are passed back and forth as part of a conversation can also have an action. Right? And there are 3 types of actions supported in Microsoft Teams. We can open a URL, we can send a message back to the bot, or you can invoke a payload, which is basically a post to a web service, right? And that allows users to do all kinds of rich interactions just by using the cards, right, and invoking an action. And as well, the card can support a minimal data input, so I can have a text box, for example, or a drop-down list, and people can choose an option and reply back right inside the card, right inside the Teams client. I don't have to switch context to a different application. I can handle it right there. So actions are again, one of these key features to help users get work done, low friction. We mentioned earlier that the activities support or the conversations support events, right? And again, the activity object would be sending back and forth, and the activity object could have an event of a different type. So the activity type is not a message, rather the activity type is a conversation update. And you'll see that I get events that say a team member has been added or removed, right? If I add a bot to a channel, I get a conversation update event, and the team member added is the ID of the bot, right? So I can understand who's in the conversation as they come and go. When channels are created, renamed, deleted, the bot can be made aware of those. Now, you don't have to handle all these events. If your bot doesn't need to understand the scope of the entire team with all the various channels, that's fine, but it may make sense to understand which users are a part of this as well. Next, let's talk a little bit about how to test your bot. As we mentioned, we have the bot framework, so I go to the bot registration portal, and that lets me set up my bot. I give it an icon, I give it a name, and the bot framework registration portal allows me to simulate a one-on-one conversation right there in line. There's also a standalone application called the Bot Framework Emulator that you can download and install and just run. You connect to a bot right on localhost, right? So in this particular scenario, that lets me test things that are running during development without exposing them to the internet. In addition, we could do what's called the ngrok or tunnel, well, tunneling public internet responses to a local address. And so ngrok is an open source tool that we'll demo and have in our lab that lets me configure a publicly accessible URL that automatically routes the request to my local machine. And that facilitates me using the bot registration portal for testing. It also facilitates using the actual Teams client to actually work with that. So you get some back and forth in there. Obviously, if you look at the slide, you'll see that the bot framework emulator lets me simulate some events, whereas the registration portal does not. It only allows for one-on-one conversations. Using a tunnel gives me the full range of capabilities, because every request made by the Teams app is then sent back to my local machine. So let's move on. We'll create a basic bot. We'll run it. We'll see how to test it. In this demo, we're going to use Visual Studio to create a basic bot that integrates with Microsoft Teams. What I'm showing you here is a Visual Studio project that I created using the bot framework's templates. You can get those from the bot framework website. The key thing I'm pointing out here is that this project is configured to run at localhost port 3979. And if you remember in our discussions earlier, we have to make sure this localhost is available to the public internet if I want to test using the Microsoft Teams application. So I'm going to go over to my ngrok tunnel, and you can see here I'm running this with that port number. Visual Studio and IIS Express work a little bit differently than the node-based web server we saw earlier, so that's why there's a host header parameter on there as well. But now I have a new tunnel opened up, and then my publicly accessible endpoint is here, so I'm going to copy this to the clipboard because we will need that for later use. Right. Now, the next thing I need to do is actually configure the bot framework registration with my web service that I'm running here. So I'm going to switch over to the browser, and in the browser, I'm going to create a new bot. So I've logged into the bot framework website. I'm going to create a new bot using the SDK. As you notice that option to build the bot in Azure, there's some significant work done in the Azure team to actually host a bot and make things all super simple for you. However, we're going to go through and run it locally. So I need to give this a name, and this is just going to be Teams Bot 1. The bot handle is important. This is going to be needed throughout the development, so I'll put that in here. Again, description, I have to put something in here, right? So we'll just put in information. And now it's asking me for my messaging endpoint. And this is where messages or activity objects that are done throughout users will be sent to my bot. So I need to have that URL endpoint in here. And furthermore, the route in the template from Visual Studio is API messages. So that will route in here, right? Next, bots need to be registered with Microsoft. So I need a Microsoft app ID and a password. That's how my code can then validate to the bot framework that yes, people are looking for bot called Teams Bot 1. I need to make sure it gets routed to me, and that responses coming from me are valid. So the web page gives us this little simple user to go through here. We just need to log in. The application will then generate an app ID for me. I'm going to copy this. I'll need that. So for now, we'll just put this in the notepad. I'm going to generate an app password and continue. It comes through. Here's my app password. Well, again, we'll copy that. And we'll click OK. And finishing, go back to the bot framework. So this is the bot registration is doing all this work for me. It remembered that ID for me, right? If I want to configure Azure App Analytics, I can do so. App Insights, I'm sorry. And then I just need to agree to the terms and click register. Right? So this will do its work. Bot's created, and I'm now back to the bot framework registration, and you can see it's connected me to web chat and Skype. And I've already got 4 issues, right? So if I can look at this and see what's going on here, there was some kind of message saying here, and I'm getting a not found message, right? If I switch over to the ngrok, you can see I'm having a message here, bad gateway, right? So what is happening, of course, is that my Visual Studio solution is not running. So I'm going to start this. And it opens up a new tab in your browser, as you'd expect Visual Studio to do. Notice the web part here. This is the home page, and it's telling me, okay, your web bot is working. You need to register it, and here is your endpoint. So you see now that that matches. And so now if I switch back to here, try this again, there is the test window here, which is hidden. If I click this, it opens up the test window. And then down at the bottom, I can type in my test. So I'm just going to type hello bot. And when I do that, it says sending, and it couldn't send, right? Again, what's going on here? I'm going to switch back over to ngrok and take a look. I got an okay, but then I got a bad gateway. So again, what's going on here? I'm going to take a quick look. I can see the message that's being sent to me, and for some reason it's not being routed. And if you notice, the response is just telling me, I have some type of error here, invalid client. So I forgot a step here. But you can see the benefit of having the ngrok tunnel running. I can see the message that came from the bot framework, and if you look down here, it says hello bot, right? And the response failed because of an error that happened in .NET. So I forgot to configure my application with that information. So I'm going to go to web.config, and if you look here, you can see I have my bot ID, right? And my bot ID, if I go, is this value that I set at the very beginning. So I'm going to switch over to the settings tab, and then I will look for the bot handle. Teams bot 1 is my bot handle. That is the value that I need to specify for my bot ID. The Microsoft App ID, again, and password, those are the values that I copied to the clipboard. So let me copy those and paste them into web.config. And we'll try it again. So I press start again. It opens up another window here. I like to close these to keep things clean. I'm back to ngrok. I'm going to click the clear button here so make sure we're all set. And if I go back to my bot registration, I can just click the retry button here, or I can type in a new message, and we'll see how we're doing here. And so I now get a response. You sent hello bot, which was 9 characters. Again, looking through the tunnel, I can see an okay. Looking back on the message here, I can see here's the message, and it replied with an okay. Right? And so this is the bot framework running. Boom, I got my stuff working. What I've done here is I used the template to get Visual Studio started, and then I configured my application, and now I can test here in the bot registration framework. That's good, right? Working. However, there's more to it than that, right? So we want to then get our bot working inside of Microsoft Teams. So there's a couple steps that further steps that we need to do. So I'm going to stop the Visual Studio project. If you remember in our first demo, we had a manifest, and then we created a zip file that had our application package. The Bot Framework SDK for .NET doesn't have those pieces in here, right? These are Microsoft Teams specific. So I'm going to add a folder to my project here. I'm going to call this manifest. And inside that, I'm going to put some files that are part of the lab files that you'll get inside the hands-on lab. And I'm going to drop these in here. This is just an icon of different sizes and my manifest.json. If you look in here, you'll see we have some placeholders. The app ID, again, this is, before we didn't care. When we were using our tab, this was generated by the Yeoman generator, and we just used whatever value was there. Using a bot, however, this is important. This ID in the bot framework has to match the app ID that we got from our registration. So I'm going to select that value and paste that in here. Obviously, we have our ngrok tunnel URL that we need as well. So let's go and grab that again. One thing I want to point out while I'm here, I'm going to just press Control-C to cancel this. And if I run it again, you'll notice now the URL is different, right? So now I have to have this new value, right? So first of all, let me go in here and we'll update all of these values. And then I'm going to go back to my bot registration. And so I'm still on the settings page. I can change this value here as much as I need. There's no limit or no problem. I can just change this with the new value, scroll to the bottom and click Save Changes. And now my bot will then use the new value. Let's try that again. Not sure what happened there. I'm going to go back to my bots just to refresh this page real quick here. Teams bot 1. And I'm going to go to the settings tab and set this again. Okay, so that worked. So now I've changed my URL and I've gone back and now in Visual Studio, I've configured my manifest. However, I still need to, and you'll notice that the manifest refers to those two icons that I included here. So now I need to create that zip file. Right? The Yeoman generator scaffolded my project that had the gulp manifest task in there. The Visual Studio pieces doesn't have all that. So we can do this by updating our CS proj file to have a build task to do that. So I'm going to open this CS proj file and I'll go down to the bottom and you'll see there are some commented out tasks for before and after build. In the lab files, we give you a simple task to actually create that zip. So I'm just going to copy this value and paste it in here. And so you'll see here, well, I put it in the wrong spot. My apologies. Get this down here. And so you can see after build, we're going to run this zip task, and here's the zip task, which actually goes through and does some C# stuff. So I'm going to save that and reload the project real quickly. And now if I do the build, it will run that new task as well. So I'm going to open up a new Explorer window here, and if I go to my project folder, so I'm in demos, bot, and go to the bin folder, and you'll notice I have my zip file. So that is the sideload package that I need to provide to Microsoft Teams. So again, we're going to start the Visual Studio project so that the web server is listening, make sure my tunnel is configured, it's running, all's good. I can now go to Microsoft Teams. Right? Now, I didn't create a new team here. I could have if I wanted to. I'm just going to go through again and to manage my team and go to the apps section and sideload an app. And now I'm going to go up to my bot folder, right? We just created this. Again, since it's visualstudio.net, it's going to be in the bin folder. And there it is. I click that. And you see here, we have a problem. Which in this particular case is I missed one of the steps inside Visual Studio, inside the manifest. So manifest.json, I have one more bot registration that has to happen here. So I missed that. So I'm going to go through and place that value. And again, run it again. I updated the CS proj with an after build task. So pressing F5 will run the build, which will then rebuild the manifest. So I can redo the sideload again. And teams bot 1. And now teams bot 1 is added as well as that. So now invoking a bot is a little bit different, right? And so I don't have a tab. This teams bot application doesn't have a tab. So in order to find it, I need to refer to it in a conversation. So here in my group channel I can then @mention. And so when I do Teams, I now see my Teams bot 1. And I can then say hello bot. And it said you sent hello bot, which is 30 characters. Well, before I thought it was 9 characters, and clearly hello bot is not 90, right? And so, again, this is one of the benefits of having the ngrok tunnel running here. So if I go back to here and I look at the most recent one, you'll see what ends up happening here is I had to do an @mention. And so you'll see that in the text, which is in here, here's the content. You'll see I end up with a rich text, the hello bot. So what's being passed to my bot is this raw scheme of content, which happens to be HTML plus the @mention. So there's some work we can do to find out what the actual words are that were actually sent to me. But the point being, I have now connected a bot to Teams. And by the way, I have this new reminder here, activity going on here. What's going on here, right? And so my bot, in addition to having the channel conversation, right, it did a reply to me. And since that is a reply to me, the Microsoft Teams app said, oh, hey, you have a response inside that channel. So again, that's all these capabilities that are now being lit up as part of the Teams application because I configured a manifest and put all these pieces together. So that's just a quick overview of how to get a bot working. I want to show you real quickly in Visual Studio what pieces come with out of the .NET framework. I'm sorry, the Bot Builder SDK for .NET. I have a web API project and I have a controller called Messages Controller. And the Messages Controller is where this response comes in, right? So this is what handles it. And it's checking to see the activity type. Remember, we showed a little bit about the activity object that controls everything. And then the type is a message. And if it's not a message, then it must be some other type of thing. And obviously, we're not trying to build this full-featured here. But in general, whenever a message comes in, the root dialog is invoked, right? And so if I go to the root dialog, you can see here the root dialog is just simply saying, I get an object is what you're sending to me. And what I'm going to do is say, I want you to get this activity, right, the activity object, and I'm just looking for the length of the text, right? And as I said, we can do more work on that later, but this is how this works. My Messages controller creates a dialog, and inside the dialog, I put whatever logic I would like to do. And we'll cover that in an advanced module as well. But this gets you an idea of what's running, and then we have a web API project. So that's our demo. We'll move on now to section 3. We'll talk about building a Microsoft Teams tab. Again, we'll cover an overview of what the tab, what we have to do in there, interacting with various systems, and then go on to the demo on that as well. So to build a Microsoft Teams tab, it's a similar set of steps. We need to design what is a great tab. And the key thing here is we want relative functionality. If I'm using a tab, I'm integrating some application, some external app. That app, what pieces of that app are relevant to the group of people who are using the Microsoft Teams application. I don't want to just host my entire app, including all its Chrome, in Microsoft Teams. I want to find the relevant pieces of functionality and understand that the scope of what you're showing in the tab should match the scope of the Teams application. And what is the user experience? Again, let them focus on what they need to get done, not on all the other stuff. You develop your tab using HTML, JavaScript, TypeScript. At the end of the day, what you're building is a web page with its related capabilities. Your web page can then talk to REST services, as you would expect. So it will help facilitate showing that it can be full-featured. Again, we're saying focus on relevant app functionality, or as little as much as you need. The Teams application allows you to do deep linking in context. So if I have a list of items and there's something I want to have a conversation on item number 3, Provider uses the ability to share a deep link to item number 3 into the chat conversation. So then the card would have a link that says, here's just item number 3, not the full list. Again, it's just a little bit of a bit to help people understand what they're trying to do and get their work done. And again, lastly, we deploy our tab. We submit it to the Office store, or we can sideload it to the Teams application. Tabs have 2 user interface experiences that we need to consider. We can configure the tab as it's added to a team, and then we also have the content that we show here. Right? And so I can configure in my manifest that I want to show a configuration page, and I can actually write a configuration page, HTML, JavaScript. It will then, as you can see, show here in a little pop-up dialog and let me collect information and configure this before it's added to the channel, right? The built into the Teams JavaScript library is the ability to set the settings, so I can specify this is the URL I want you to show the content in, and you get a unique identifier, or generate a unique identifier for your tab, and that helps me understand what exactly I need to show inside my content page. The content page itself is rendered inside an iframe inside the Teams application. You have a content URL, which you can specify in the manifest, or more likely you would set as part of the configuration page saving, and that can include query string parameters if you need them as well. Right? When your tab is rendered, you are passed in through a context object, or you can retrieve a context object that would have an entity ID and perhaps a sub-entity ID. That entity ID would be something that's related to the value you set during configuration. A sub-entity ID is part of that deep linking process we mentioned. You can also make a call to retrieve the state around the certain entity or sub-entity or the user. And so if a user has been in the tab previously and doing some work and they paused and went back and they went to the conversation and came back, you can retrieve that state, save and retrieve that state to help them accomplish their tasks there. A lot of this work happens through the Teams API for JavaScript, this context for the user or the team of the organization. And as I mentioned, context can be passed into your tab using URL placeholders. So you can specify a placeholder, and at runtime, the Teams application will replace the placeholder, the value of the placeholder, with the value from the context object. In addition, there is a JavaScript API that you can call, say, get me the current context. And you can see the stuff that you'd expect to see as part of a tab are shown, or is returned as part of that context object. They're listed there on the slide. But it's not just interacting with the Teams application that you'll want to do. You'll also want to interact with external services. Inside a tab, you're in HTML and JavaScript. Right? So a couple considerations we need to worry about when we're interacting with these external services. Number one, you might need to authenticate to your service. Right? And so Microsoft has an authentication service provided by Azure Active Directory and the Microsoft Graph, which we'll cover a little bit as part of our demo. The context here, the authentication happens here, cannot happen inside of an iframe. Right? That's just a security prevention using browsers. We want to make sure that users can see and interact with the authentication mechanisms instead of happening silently in an iframe. And so the Microsoft Teams application that provides in this JavaScript library the ability for us to then launch a pop-up and pass the data from the pop-up back to the Teams application and back to your tab inside the iframe. And you see here we have this authenticate method in which we can pass to the Teams application, go to a certain URL to facilitate the authentication flow, and I can specify height and width. And then, of course, I have the success and failure options to say, did it work or did it not work? Right? And then that auth URL is something that you provide. It is a page that you would provide. It's displayed in the top level iframe. And then in that page, you can then obviously redirect to Azure Active Directory or do whatever authentication mechanism you see. And that, again, that auth URL is a page that you control, and then you can pass back to or notify back to the Teams application a success or a failure. And typically what you would do is do some type of token acquisition inside this auth URL page, and once you have the token, you can then pass it back to the Teams application through the notify success method. Similarly, when we're inside an iframe, we want to make sure we understand the cross-domain applications, and that is a security risk as well. So the Teams application imposes a restriction in which you cannot access a URL unless it's been pre-described. And so I have this valid domains list that I specify inside my manifest when I build the application. If you want to navigate from the HTML page that you provided as your content URL, you want to navigate to some other page, that would fail. But we can tell Microsoft Teams, I want to navigate cross-domain. So again, you make a call in here, your iframe is then redirected. Conversely, this is not necessarily put in the documentation, but if you call the authenticate method, it shows a pop-up window. You could, in fact, specify the auth URL, that pop-up window, to be some other URLs. As long as it's in the list of valid domains, it'll be rendered and you can handle it there. So a couple of things to keep in mind that you will then need to show if you want to cross-domain or do authentication, you will have to have the Teams application help you do that. So let's move on to a demo in which we're going to call a Microsoft Graph inside a tab and see how that all works. Returning now to the Teams application, I've pre-configured this demo and I'll show you the end goal, how it works, and then we'll look back into the code pieces that we did to make it function as such. So I've taken the tab that we created in the first section of this module and I extended it. So now if you can see, I have tab Teams App 1 tab configured in my site. If I click on it now, you still see it's just showing the value is like we saw before, and I've added a button. I want to show you the configuration options. When we add a tab, we were prompted for configuration URL, but we can also invoke that URL at any time by choosing the chevron next to the tab title and choosing settings. This shows the exact same config URL that we get during the initial loading experience. I've extended this to say I want to call Microsoft Graph, and I can do this in one of two methods. I can do member information or group calendar. Although at the moment I'm not actually showing too many items out of the calendar, but you get the idea that I can choose different options. And based on which one I choose, I click save, this updates the value as you saw before. So working just as we expect. I'm going to go first real quick and go to member information and choose, so I'll choose member information and I'll click save. Now when I click get MS Graph data, I now need to connect to Microsoft Graph. And so you can see I'm showing the dialog screen logging with that information. So I'll do my login. Obviously, having pre-run this demo, I don't get the consent dialog, but you can see I am able to call and get my information as we'd expect. Okay, now, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong button here. So let's go through now and we'll choose this now to let's do the group calendar. So I have the group calendar and I'm going to click on admin or tenant admin, as it says it needs tenant admin. So now I'm invoking the tenant admin experience. I can log in and says, do you want to grant permission to these? And this particular one says read all groups. So when I click accept, I've now done the tenant admin consent experience. I click save. You'll notice the group now is calendar. I click to get the data here. It still makes me log in because I'm doing a different function here, but notice it didn't prompt me for a password. And now I see group information, which although it looks very much the same, it is actually a different group. So you notice here the description is demo 1. So that's our running demo. Let's look at the various pieces. The first piece is I want to show you is the app registration. And so this is Teams App 1. Initially, when I did the tab configuration, I didn't have to register anything. I can just load a tab in Microsoft Teams and it works just fine. But since I now want to connect to Microsoft Graph, I need to register that application. So I went to apps.dev.microsoft.com and I created an app, and I've noticed here that I've added two what they call redirect URLs. These are two different URLs that could be referenced during the login experience. The auth.html is the one for when a single user logs in. The admin consent is when I choose the link that says provide group or admin consent. Since I want both of those to work with the Azure Active Directory, I need to provide both of them. In addition, I've ticked the box that says allow implicit flow. That's what's used when I am using JavaScript. I don't have some permanent storage for an app secret. Further down, we scroll down to the permission set, and while they're not technically required, they could be requested at runtime as well. Just FYI, you can see here that this app has user read and group read, which is admin only. Now, if you're doing this module and you don't have tenant permissions, you could just skip the sections that say group read and do just the member information. It will still work just fine. This is just here to be completely updated for you. So that is our app registration. Now let's go back over to the code. So in Visual Studio Code, you'll see here I still have the same information here. I've updated my manifest to have a different URL that goes with the tunnel that's running. But if I go into the app and start looking, you see there's more pieces here than we had before. So first of all, let's look at our configuration HTML. Right? And so in the config HTML, you can see here now we have this drop the select box to choose the two informations here. I have my link here, which is calling my request consent, right? So this is very straightforward information. Nothing really is too much different here, but you can see I've got this link, and here's the function. It says call the admin consent. Obviously, this HTML is calling into my JavaScript or TypeScript. So if I look at my config TypeScript, you'll have some information added in here. Here's where I'm getting the context to determine what choice was picked, the members or calendar. And then when you click the save button, I'm going to save that information. And you can see here's my get consent. And this is the part where we talked about in the slides where we say we need to call the helper function. So in this particular example, we'll say I want you to call hey teams, I want you to do the authenticate function, which is going to show that pop-up. And what I want you to render is my admin consent page, passing in a tenant ID, which is what I need, right? And then if it's success, I don't do anything. If it's failure, I see here, when admin consent doesn't return any data to me, it only provides the consent. So I don't really need to do anything. But the key section here is that when I call authenticate, I'm passing in a URL to a page that I control that will then invoke this experience for me. If I look at this admin consent page, which is here, you'll notice if I collapse this down, we don't have any HTML. This is simply script. I don't need to render this experience because Azure Active Directory does this for me. All I'm simply doing is say, when you get here, I want you to redirect back to the Azure Active Directory. So you can see I don't have any HTML here. I just simply have some JavaScript functions that are utility work here. But the key thing is here is I'm invoking the admin consent method in my TypeScript. And then in my TypeScript, you can see the admin consent is going to simply configure the message that I need, the host name, right? So the return is going to come back to localhost admin consent. Here's my client ID from the app registration. And then you can see I'm just redirecting right to login.microsoft.com, and it'll do all that work. When that stuff gets posted back to the admin consent, this is where the response comes in. And if the response is something, I can notify Teams I had success. Otherwise, I can pass on to any type of error. And the idea here is pretty straightforward. We're just saying, hey, popped up the dialog, redirect to the authentication experience built in the Azure Active Directory, and when you're done, pass the data back on. That's pretty straightforward. So that's my configuration page. Now let's look into the actual tab itself. The actual tab itself, we still have the same information with the loading, and you can see the button, right? It's calling it, right? And then we're just wiring up some stuff here in our TypeScript that says I want you to run our method in TypeScript. So in our TypeScript, this do stuff method is what gets called, right? So you can see we're just going to wire up a button event listener, just like you would typically do in any other JavaScript application, and get our context and make sure we understand what's doing here, showing the value, right? The get data button is where the magic happens, if you will. So when I click on the button, it says, I'm sorry, click the refresh. When I click the button, it runs the refresh method. And the refresh method is actually going to do a similar process. I'm going to load the authentication pop-up, and this time I'm going to pass in my auth.html. And when that is done, what I'm expecting to get here is a token, and then I can pass that token into my get data method. Right? Let's take a quick look at the auth page. Again, the auth page doesn't have any HTML. It's just referring to this perform auth method inside TypeScript. And in TypeScript, you can see the perform auth method does a similar thing. We're saying I want scopes for the user or for the group. And here's my application, and I'm just going to call into the Microsoft Authentication library and say, I want to do this application, do this authentication for me. It will then prompt the information as necessary. I can then handle my response, and in the response here, I'm going to get the token that's returned to me and pass that token back to Microsoft Teams using this notify success method, which then routes it back to my JavaScript as the token. And then lastly, the get data is a straight Microsoft Graph call. You see I'm calling graph.microsoft.com/me or /groups, depending on which point, which configuration option I've done. And then I'm just, in this particular example, I'm not rendering anything fancy data. I'm just getting it and converting it to JSON and showing it. And that is why you see here when I click to show the data, I'm getting just the JSON object here. So what did I have to do to make this all happen, right? So a couple things that I needed to do. You'll notice when I first generate the tab using the Yeoman generator in my HTML, you'll see how it's wiring up this, creating a new object. This Teams App 1 object is the TypeScript information. That's this here, Teams App 1. If I scroll back up here, this is my Teams App 1 tab 1, right? So there's a little bit disconnect that happens here. It's kind of a convention-based thing that you have to understand what's happening. And so what really under the covers is going on here, right? And so the key thing that we want to understand is when I come into the client.ts, the Yeoman generator generified this file and it says, really be careful what you're doing here. And what it's saying is, I want you to export all these TS files. And so I need to come in here and add a couple for admin and auth. And this idea here, this client.ts, is part of that gulp build process. It looks at this and says, oh, I need to also include all these items into the top level namespace. And by doing that, when I look at the HTML for the tab, that's where I get my top level namespace being Teams App 1. And then Teams App 1 tab is the value of this class, Teams App 1 tab. So you can see that connection to make that work here. And the beauty of this is that I can just keep my code separate into different files as I would normally any other project, and the build process will aggregate them all together. One last thing I should probably point out is this inject option here, inject. And so this is at the build time, what will end up happening is the JavaScript that's generated from this TypeScript transpile is injected as a script tag into this. So the HTML that gets rendered during runtime will have all that information together. We can see that by going to my ngrok here, and if I look at my tab.html, well, let's find the one that has the 200. Sorry about that. And so the response, you can see it has this script tag here that's pointing out to us. So it injected a script tag so that all my code gets loaded at runtime. And when I'm navigating and working inside the Teams app, all the functions exist as we need there. So that is our demo on creating a tab that will then call out to Microsoft Graph. Again, just to summarize, I created pages to handle the authentication. I created a page to handle admin consent, which obviously is optional depending on your requirements. And then I just connected those pages together in my JavaScript method by extending the tab TS and the config TS to call into those pages, leveraging the authenticate method to show the dialog. That concludes our module on fundamentals of Microsoft Teams, in which we covered application packaging and testing, and basic bots and basic tabs. There's one more Teams module about discussing advanced techniques, in which we cover advanced bots and compose extensions, as well as combining multiple capabilities into a single application. Thank you.